Thumper is one of my favorite rhythm games, but at first glance it might not even look like one. You don't play notes on a musical track, instead you control a beetle on a railway through a psychedelic fever dream. The creators of the game, Drool, call it rhythm violence. They wanted to strip the genre down to two basic inputs, the control stick and the face button, and see how far they could go with it. Before I go any further, for clarity, I'm not going to be using what the developers called levels and sublevels. I will be calling the levels chapters and the sublevels just levels. I think this is a much easier way to discuss the game. Okay, let's continue. Even though Thumper doesn't pretend that you're playing an instrument or has a discernible soundtrack, it still fits comfortably in the rhythm genre. While it's not the focus or singled out to you, the noises your beetle makes resemble some machinist otherworldly beats. Early chapters, I doubt you'll even think of what you're doing in terms of how it sounds musically. After a while, you may hear how every action you do creates a different sound, and when pairing them all together in quick succession at different tempos, you start to hear the full picture. Not only do your actions create sound, the hazards themselves when they appear make a different noise than when they are interacted with. It creates a nice dynamic in the early chapters where you can hear the calling of a new hazard and your beetle answers back with a slightly different sound reacting to it. There seem to be certain hazards that weren't included to add to the challenge, but instead their spawning audio cue contributes to the soundscape. The clearest example are the turns at the end of multiple tracks. You can only turn off of a track once, of course, but there will sometimes be a turn on both sides even though you were just interacting with the middle track. I don't necessarily think both sides spawning at once makes an interesting sound, but I don't see any other reason why it was implemented. There are plenty of similar beats the game comes back to, maybe a theme of sorts. They are sometimes so prevalent you can associate a specific rhythm to one of the chapters. These moments end up feeling like a break after a while. If you had been having a hard time keeping up with the seemingly random assortment of turns and thumps, going back to the familiar rhythm might get you back on track. I've seen some describe this game as psychological horror, and while I wouldn't put that label on it, I can see what they mean. As you're timing your inputs to the visual and audio cues, you will encounter a few monstrosities that hover over the end of your track. These are the only things in the game that actively try to kill you, everything else acts like a static obstacle. Without them, I don't think the game could have that horror feeling to it. Strip them out entirely and that descriptor might fade away. Them only appearing in the last level of a chapter might make it seem like there are X amount of regular rhythm tracks and one horror track, like there's a separation between the two. However, because levels all transition into each other and every chapter ends with the gruesome demon, it gives the feeling that everything on that track is connected and was always leading up to this. In a way, it contextualizes all of the previous obstacles you've seen so far as potentially coming from this entity, like it was all part of their attempt to slay you. Nowhere is this more evident than when after you finish the boss level, as immediately after you are freed from all oncoming hazards as you watch your beetle ride while the screen fades to black. The fact that there are bosses at all is another example that Thumper wasn't supposed to look like a traditional rhythm game. You aren't trying to mess up their flow like in Guitar Hero 3 boss battles either. You're avoiding damage and at the end of the sequence physically harming them. However, the battle that's taking place is basically window dressing. You're still keeping rhythm the same, just the last input on the sequence sends a shockwave towards the boss. Functionally, the only change is that you can't miss, otherwise you need to restart, but even though on a surface level your inputs will look the same, what's happening on screen creates a different mood and atmosphere, which to me separates it enough to be significant. There are mini-bosses and final bosses in each chapter. Starting in the beginning level, the first mini-boss serves as the tutorial for the thumb button press, the simplest of your moveset. As you progress through the chapter, you learn how to turn, how to hold the button press to slide into red bars, and piecing it all together for the final boss of the chapter. Eventually, you learn how to jump to avoid spikes or hit blue rings, press down after a jump on a thump to break shields or supercharge a thump to replenish your shield back, shift to parallel tracks to avoid snakes, and jump twice in a row to keep your airtime going much longer. Thumper actually has a really good manual, but I don't know how many people saw it since it was a document I had to open outside of the game. It explains its scoring system, the terminology, controls, and the basic and advanced gameplay mechanics. I wish more games had a manual as good as this one. Even without it, it's remarkable how well Thumper transitions from extremely easy to perform tasks to requiring near Twitch-level pattern recognition close to the end. With the oppressive atmosphere, in addition to the tunnel vision you need for this game, playing in a dark, quiet room with no distractions is ideal. It's also not a bad idea to play this game in short bursts, as it takes an incredible amount of your focus. This isn't the kind of game where you can turn your brain off, or at times even blink. Thumper takes this into account and either gives you a long pause at the beginning of a new level to catch your breath, or sometimes takes advantage of your potential fatigue and blitzes you with thumps moments after the last level, not even allowing you time to look at your score. There's an ebb and flow with the level length and complexity within chapters as well. One might last 25 seconds and not seem very difficult, while the next one lasts nearly 2 minutes and feels like a gauntlet. Level 9-7 in particular is one that felt like it was never going to end. The way Thumper handles its difficulty is very clever. There are 2 ways the game lets players slide by with less than perfect play. First of all, you are allowed to take one hit without forcing a restart. You are given an outer layer, a shield of sorts, on the beetle that gets stripped away when you miss specific inputs. Once you finish the level, you get it back if you time your button press correctly. So if you aren't the best at the game, don't care about your score, and want to push through to the end, you have one safety net. The second and more clever way the game helps struggling players is which obstacles deal damage and which ones are only there to increase your score multiplier. The thumbs that you need to time your button press to hit are completely optional in most scenarios. If a player wanted to ignore score in the early chapters, you could just hold the button down through it all, focusing only on the tight turns. Eventually you of course will need to hit thumbs with the laser sentries and boss fights, but the blue rings are always optional. They grant points based on your multiplier, but there are no punishments for missing them with any variation of hazard or boss. Likewise, you can turn as early as you'd like for the tight turns. Perfect turns grant you points, but if that's not what you care about, you will survive just fine with less than perfect timing. If you attempt to S-rank everything, it gets a lot more difficult. Thumbs need to be hit every time to maintain your multiplier. Red bars, perfect turns, and blue rings are essential for points. Perfect turns are of course very risky, and hitting them all in addition to every other quick input can be stressful. The only way to obtain the blue rings is to jump, and if there are rings before and after turns, you need to chain those turns together perfectly to maintain your airtime. For the most part, I think the game challenges you in a fair way. However, there are a few ways the game gets more difficult that I don't like. There are laser sentries that sometimes appear around your track. Mechanically, it changes the thumps in your path, so if you miss one, it will damage you. I would be fine with that if it didn't obstruct your vision and create an extra noise that is offbeat and can distract you. I'm sure it was intended, as making the light pads be required or taking damage isn't a huge difficulty spike on its own. I'm just not a fan of this approach. The speed at which you need to react to the visual and audio cues in the game are already so tight, getting in the way of that feels like the game is playing unfairly. You've learned to rely on certain cues, and they basically overpower them with distractions. The second thing in the game I think is less than fair is unfortunately in nearly every level: the tunnels. Like I said earlier, you rely on audio and visual cues throughout the entire game. Sometimes the noises you make from your inputs overpower the audio cues of upcoming hazards. This means a lot of what you'll be paying attention to is what you're seeing. When in tunnels, well, you get tunnel vision basically. Your line of sight is severely reduced, requiring much faster visual reaction times than usual. It makes every time you're in a tunnel feel like an entirely different difficulty setting. The last thing I dislike is when in level 7-7 and beyond, the game can now twist the track jarringly like a roller coaster. I understand the appeal of this, but it sometimes jerks you around moments before a hazard, which gives you barely any time to react. It's like the tunnel issue, but worse. The worst moment was in level 7-8, when not only is the twisting and turning happening, but the laser sentry is also a factor. Both of those combined make certain sections borderline impossible without trial and error. I sincerely doubt anyone can pass this level first try without taking damage. You can see the blue ring for maybe 2 frames, then the sentry gets in the way of it, then it shows up a few frames later, literally milliseconds before you have to hit it. In Chapter 9, the twisting of the track is so bad that because the game knows you'll have no chance to react when seeing the hazard, it needs to add a visual flare that you can see through the track itself just so you know it's there. Chapter 9 should be the compilation and test of everything you've learned in the game, but instead it seems to only stick to the same few things. They reuse the same few sequences and mechanics into each other so often, I was questioning what the point of it all was. The thumps into tight turns. I saw this happen so often, and after the first couple of times, left me wondering why the game was testing me on the sequence again and again. The snakes on the tracks. Another one where it wasn't getting more challenging, and the only way they added something new was when they finally decided to add a thump before you had to move from the snake. For the most part, it's the same thing, sometimes 3 to 5 times in a row of going back and forth between tracks avoiding them. After a while, the lack of complexity starts to wear on you. Now that we've discussed all the obstacles, beats, hazards, and gameplay mechanics, I want to quickly return back to the bosses of the game. I think Thumper is the type of game to ramp up considerably as you go along. There are plenty of moments, like I mentioned, that give you some space to cool down, but in general, the further you get, the harder it gets. That's not always the case for the final boss levels. A lot of the early bosses seem much easier than regular tracks from the same chapter. I'd say early on the only way it tries to challenge the player in these scenarios is giving them a weird offbeat and some sequences they haven't seen a whole lot. I don't think that was enough for basically every chapter before Chapter 7. It ends up feeling like an anticlimax. The final boss of Chapter 5 in particular feels very weak, and before you know it, it's over. One thing that should be mentioned is every boss level has 4 sequences. You have to survive and play well enough to damage the boss 4 times for it to end. I say this because it seems like a few of those sequences are wasted trying to familiarize the player with old mechanics again. Chapter 7's final boss is good, and is the only boss in the game to take 5 hits to kill. I like the final sequence as it's very challenging, but the 2 that come before it are kind of boring. I like that the level is trying to build up to a climax, but the 3rd sequence is dumbed down to you jumping over spikes and pounding the next thump. It just seems like the game doesn't take advantage of the 4 sequences in the boss fights to use as a test of what the player has learned, but rather uses them for... well, I'm not exactly sure. For the most part, it doesn't feel connected to the mechanics of the previous levels. The last sequence of the final boss in Chapter 8 is a perfect example of this. You've been thumping, turning, and jumping for the first 3 sequences, which was fairly difficult, then you get to the last one. There's a laser sentry and snakes, but you just need to press the thumps and it's over like that. A very bizarre way to finish the chapter. The final boss of Chapter 9 is also confusing. I would argue the only fairly challenging sequence is the final one, but if you mess up without taking damage on it, you have to wait a very long time to continue. If you have to restart, going through the 3rd sequence again feels like the game is just testing your patience. This turn into turn sequence is one the player has seen many times throughout the game, and it lasts 10 seconds with 12 of the same turns in a row. Followed by the final sequence, which like I've said is sufficiently difficult, but in a completely different and separate way from anything else in the boss level. An argument could be made that this chaotic and random level layout fits the game very well. It's a game with sharp edges, so a smooth experience maybe wasn't the goal. Subverting expectations is something that can turn something good into something great, but for the most part I would have liked something a little more tied together for the final boss fights. After you complete the final boss of Chapter 9, the game nearly subverts expectations in a really cool way. I say nearly because the pause menu spoils it if you looked beforehand. There are 2 more levels after the boss. The first one is a normal level, except it speeds up considerably as it goes along. The last one is level Infinity, the true end boss level. This one came out of nowhere for me. I was not expecting this at all. The level speeds up and slows down as you go along. It's like you went too far and broke the world you're in, or maybe found the creator of it. I'm sure there are plenty of theories on what this pyramid is, what is happening once you hit the final blow, or where you're going. Is it an entrance or an exit? Playing Thumper is like entering some other dimension. Nothing about it resembles anything human, the closest it gets is the Demon Head final boss. It also doesn't resemble any other game. There are plenty in the rhythm genre that don't involve a fake instrument or dancing, but most of them are a lot more casual and a lot less violent. If you want a challenging, visceral experience, or even just a unique take on the genre, you can't really go wrong with Thumper. Thanks for watching, everyone. You can subscribe to the channel for more. My next video will hopefully be on Luigi's Mansion 3. After that, I have a few ideas for the future that I don't want to spoil just yet. Hope to see you next time. Have a good one.